Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Serverless 360 webinar on Let Systems Communicate with Azure Integration Services, hosted by Steve Janvikas. So Steve Jan is a Microsoft Azure MVP and technical integration architect at HSO. Also, he has around 20 plus years of experience in leading enterprise solutions and technology delivery across a wide range of sectors. Today, Steve Jan will be highlighting on how Azure integration services like Logic Apps, APIMs, Service Bus, and more could help build solutions in Azure to facilitate communication between on-premise systems, SaaS systems, and Azure services. I'm sure you would be excited to listen to Steve talk on these current technologies. And before I hand it over to him, I would like to emphasize on Integrate Remote 2021. So this event brings together experts in the Microsoft integration space for a fully virtual conference. This is a 3-day event with speakers from Microsoft Product Group and the global integration community, transports the Integrate experience to wherever you are and connects you to the global community. I insist you to make use of this opportunity by registering for this event. At this point, I would like to hand over the session to Steve Jan, and the stage is all yours, Steve.
Cool, then I'm going to take it away. So welcome to this live webinar. We're going to talk about Azure Integration Systems, or at least integrating systems using Azure Integration Services. Already been introduced, so I work at HSO, which is an ISV in the Netherlands. They do a lot of Dynamics implementations and integration as well. Azure MVP for quite a while. I started out in the integration space, BizTalk, so that was 10 years ago. I write for InfoQ, so this is a global media website available in various languages, talking about different type of technologies, cloud technologies, AWS, Google, Azure, and so forth. So I'm one of the editors. I predominantly focus on cloud in this case. Organizer of events, so the WAZUG, which is the Dutch Azure user group, organizer of Lowlands, which is a one-day conference, and also a writer at Serverless Notes. I like to run. Fortunately, due to the pandemic, I haven't, do some preparations, but I haven't been able to do a race. So hopefully at the end of the year or maybe next year, it will be able again. Okay, so what do I have in store for you guys today? A little bit of the agenda. This is kind of my complete story. We'll look a bit at market because I think a market perspective is interesting as well. We'll look at solution architecture with regards to those Azure integration services and more in general viewpoint. Look at some of the technology, so that will be the Azure integration services. Then we'll look at some of the real world cases in combination with best practices, some takeaways, and then we'll do some Q&A as well. Okay, so what do analysts say? I think you might have seen some of these Gartner Magic Quadrants, and one of them, and this is interesting because this is where some of the integration services fall under what Microsoft offers. This is a quadrant for the Enterprise Integration Application Platform as a service. And Microsoft's pretty well competing in that space, and it's also moved into the top quadrant as a leader. So this is already the case for the last 3 years. So it's very well in competition with similar type of capabilities offered by MuleSoft, Jitterbit, Boomi. So those are kind of more products that are available as a kind of a SaaS solution enabling the integration, while Microsoft offers, a various set of services, which I will talk about, enabling to do integration as well. Similarly, part of the integration services application of API management. And what's interesting about this is that this product now also moved into the leader quadrant. So you really see that these services Microsoft offer that I'm going to talk about have really moved into a space where they can really compete with other products, such as in this case Kong, which is an open source API management tool, and Xway and so forth. Okay, so that's the marketing perspective. But what about if you want to connect systems together, whether they're on-prem systems, whether they're systems that are in the cloud, or you want to do a hybrid solution type of thing, or you want a complete cloud native type of integration solution? What would be the case then? So initially you would look at the solution architecture. So you need to set up some building blocks and set some responsibilities left and right. So it's not just about, like in the business world, create a schema, so maybe an orchestration, do some mappings and then deploy it. There's more to it than just that. And that's kind of what this picture depicts as well. If you look holistically to how you would set up an integration solution, you're dealing one end with messaging, you have your integration, you have your APIs that sits on the boundary of your integrations potentially. And with BizTalk, that would be the adapters. You have to deal with monitoring and operations on one end. You have to deal with application lifecycle management. You've got security aspects and infrastructure. So in general, this would be your complete architecture. So going forward, you can plot some of the responsibility holistically to all these parts. So with monitoring, you deal with alerts and tracing. With security, it depends on who can access the data or who can access the services. And it's pretty important because this day and age, we're dealing with a lot of online data, and that can also be personal identifiable data. So that needs to be secure as well. So that's an aspect. And especially with integration between systems, you're dealing either with financial data and such. So that's pretty important to have those aspects in mind. On the other end, you're dealing with things to deploy. So your components you need to deploy in Azure using Azure DevOps. Back in the BizTalk days, you had the BizTalk deployment framework and such. So you have that aspect, and then the infrastructure depends on networking, availability, disaster recovery, governance, and so forth. And then in the middle, you find some of the capabilities that you probably can pretty well recognize with connectors, workflows, with APIs. You're dealing with scalability, versioning, making it accessible to others, and you got your messaging between systems, or dequeuing or decoupling them using queues. And if you go further, and if you plot this completely to what Azure has to offer, then you kind of can see all these components coming back. So you have your application insight monitor on the top, you got your DevOps on one end, you got your Key Vault and Active Directory on one end, and then below you find portals, networking, ARM. So that's all got to do with your solution in the end. And this is where you also find some of the components that are necessary for your integration. So that could be logic apps, event grid, service bus, API management, some of the things we're going to talk about. Data factory is put in here as well. If you look at integration, but that's more data integration or extra ETL type of processes. So one end you could say, well, for batch processing, you would more defer it maybe to data factory than you would use logic apps. Okay, so let's dive into that integration technology. So we talked a bit about, holistically about these components and how they would fit in a more kind of a reference architecture, or how you would look at holistically how to set that up. But what about those components? What about those Azure Integration Services that are necessary to enable a communication between systems? So it's 4 of them. So they're kind of separate services. It's not like you click somewhere in the portal saying, hey, Azure Integration Services, and then you get something. No, these are individual services. So you might recognize them in logic apps, in the service bus, event grid, and API management. Those combined are being labeled as Azure Integration Services, each serving a certain purpose. And combined, you would see that as some of the functionality that you would also see with BizTalk Server if you compare to a box product from the past. Some of these aspects are now more fragmented into, or at least you find some of these things back in these services. So let's look at logic apps. I'm just going to talk a bit about these services. I'm not going to completely in depth, but logic apps is one of the services that's been out there since 2016 when it GA, so it's out there for a couple of years now. Enabling you to connect all kinds of systems, SaaS systems, Azure services. Through API management, you can consume some of those proxies that have been created in API management through an on-premise data gateway. You can have connectivity with SQL Server and other products. And you can even self-host API management and enable connectivity as well. So there's a lot of scenarios thinkable and possible, allowing you to do integration and also allowing you to have systems communicate with each other from that perspective. You can also build integrations completely with other Azure services, so you can create smart type of solutions by leveraging cognitive services because there are connectors available to do so. Another component of the Azure Integration Services is API management. So this is a service that sits as a kind of a gateway between the producing or the applications, the APIs on one end, and the consumers on the other end. That could be first or third party applications, and that gateway is kind of an intermediate between those. So you can this way expose some of your functions and logic apps and APIs through an API proxy or definition, and then you expose each of those operations to the outside world. So you can connect some of those operations in your API to multiple functions and logic apps if you like to, or you can secure those with using API management and then enable all off, or connecting to an identity provider and force token validation and so forth by leveraging the capability of policies. So that's API management for you. Then another one is the service bus. I think this is one of the older offerings in Microsoft on the Azure platform, I would say. So that's a fully managed service capability, or at least a queuing mechanism. Something you can compare it maybe in the past with regards to the queue itself with Microsoft Message Queuing, or the other products like RabbitMQ. And RabbitMQ even now today is a managed capability in other cloud platform. But it kind of provides you communication between systems in an asynchronous way. It supports various protocols. It has things like first in, first out, deduplication transaction support. So don't see this as a simple queue in Azure Storage. This has much more capabilities than that simple queue. It has entities like relay, queues, and topics. So that relay is like a synchronous call you can do from the outside world in. So through an outbound connection, you can connect or at least have access to a service running on-premise. So the on-premise data gateway, for instance, is a capability that you leverage the relay. So if you install that component on-prem, you would see in the logging, in the logs of the installation, that it will actually on the background create this relay. So this is kind of the way into your on-premise world using such a capability with relay. The other one is just the queue, where you can send messages to. So one or multiple parties can send a message to a queue, and then there's only one consumer on the other end. If you want to have multiple consumers, then you have to think about topic, which is a kind of an Uber queue, which has all these subscriptions, and then you kind of have the same capability as you could have with the message box in BizTalk Server. And then finally, and besides having a service bus that is based on this PubSub mechanism, similarly, also Event Grid is more on the PubSub mechanism, but then you're talking more about a push-push capability. So this means that sources like Azure services that support Event Grid, but also custom, your own capable services, applications that you can build, can also send out events, which adhere to a certain schema, which are sent to the central topic managed by Event Grid, and that can be sent out to multiple handlers, as you can see in the picture as well. So this could be functions, this could be logic apps, this could be event hubs if you want to buffer some of those events, pushing them into that way. And it could also be other services that, through a webhook mechanism or such, consume those services. So this is more event-based, so this is more about notification stuff, or something happened that you might or might not respond to it. It's different than the service bus where you send a message and then it's being pulled off. So that's like push-pull, and that's more transactional. Now this will be more clear if I talk about the components in the wild, as in these scenarios I have for you in the real world. And that brings me to my next section. So I talked a bit about, in general, the the real evolved and mature services Microsoft offers, about the service itself, the architecture, but bringing those together in the real world, how does that look? So I have a few examples for you. So one of the first is a Dynamics 365 finance and supply chain management integration. So this is how Dynamics is labeled now. It's still the same product as before. It was labeled Dynamics Finance and Operations. Now it's Supply Chain Management. And what it now supports is something that's called a business event, allowing you to configure connectivity with the outside world, for instance, an event grid topic, and then send out an event. So something happens within Dynamics, an update to an entity, you configure that entity what's called a business event. The business event contains some of the data elements that's going to be pushed out in the event. In this case, it pushes an event out that something happened. a product order is being emitted, like something happened in Dynamics, and this means that some system or needs to have some of that data. So what happens, and this is kind of a detailed picture, is that there's a logic app that will receive that event because it's hooked as a subscriber to that topic. It will, as you see in 3, call back to Dynamics 365, getting some more data. So kind of assemble a message. So instead of sending out a message and then just keep pulling that queue and like, okay, I want to know what happened. This is more like more efficient business events, and then your integration starts responding. An enriched message is being created that's being pushed on top of a queue, as you can see, and that's leads to that message being picked up by another logic app. So now it becomes more transactional. It will do some mapping stuff inside the logic app, calling out to a function as well, which is not depicted in this picture. And then it will send out a text message to a storage account using the Azure files, and then a system on-prem can pick it up. It's created that connectivity. So this is kind of a Dynamics 365 holistic or detailed picture about an integration that we sometimes create. The beauty is that Dynamics Finance and Supply Chain Management now supports, eventing basically. So you can send out an event, which leads to response, which leads to an output towards a target system. Another example I have is a more cloud native integration. Similar kind of paradigm where one system needs to talk with another system. So it's more an event based because the data needs to be consistent. So that's why we choose for a kind of a near real-time approach. A change happens in Salesforce, it will push out the event towards first a logic app based on the fact that Salesforce, the way it was set up, it doesn't support the native proprietary schema of Event Grid. It does contain a few elements that are necessary to create the complete event that's being pushed towards an Event Grid topic. So any event from Salesforce will always go to this one logic app, which subsequently will push it to an event handler, which is a logic app as well in this case. That logic app will call out to Salesforce, but the connectivity with Salesforce is arranged through API management. So the API management sits in the middle to deal with some of things like security. So what you see here is also a policy for an outbound call to Salesforce. The first thing it needs to do before the actual operations can be done, like, okay, give me the data based on this identification I have, which was in this event, is creating a token. As you can see, so it's kind of needs a token, so it will send out some details. It will get the token back, which is usually kind of a username, a password type of thing. It will have that token, and each subsequent call to Salesforce will have that token in it. It will give me a response back. The response, for instance, I can also map in a outbound policy to a format that I want. Then it will push that data back to the logic app, and the logic app will subsequently push that data to ServiceNow, where there will be an additional mapping to the format that ServiceNow will require it, and then the update is done. So this is an example of a cloud native integration between systems using, again, leveraging Azure API Management, Logic Apps, and also Event Grid, all part of the Azure Integration Services. And then as a final one, I like to talk a bit about, and that's a hybrid integration where BizTalk still plays a certain role. There's some on-premise systems that are pretty unlikely to move to the cloud in the next couple of years. Those are more in-house systems, warehouse management systems and such. So they will push data out because that data needs to go more centrally to Dynamics Finance and Operations back in the day. So that's a couple of years back I built this together with a few other people. That data, that operational data needs to go to Dynamics, and there's other data that needs to go there as well. So it's moving from A to B, moving from data from on-prem centrally to a solution called Dynamics 365. The on-prem workload is being mapped, so that's only a responsibility that the BizTalk instance has, and then it will push the data towards a logic app. The workload, the logic app again is being secured because it's an HTTP triggered logic app by API management, which subsequently will push that workload towards Dynamics. Again, doing some mapping in this case in the policies available within API management. So this is what in this case happens, it's a flow from on-prem to Dynamics 365. Again, leveraging API management and the Logic app. Okay. So I talked about some of the real-world aspects for the Azure Integration Services, and now I want to focus a little bit more on best practices and going back to the solution architecture, components, and responsibilities I talked about before. So let's look more to best practices and stuff that you need to think about when you build up this complete architecture in those cases. So you have to deal with loosely coupling on one end. You don't want to tie those systems together to create some kind of spaghetti. So this enables you to either leverage event grid when it has to be more real time, or when it has to be transactional, you'll use the service bus. Monitoring, of course, is key when it's not just the technical monitoring, but also the monitoring from A to B, so more the functional monitoring. You have to think about the timely manner that data needs to be consistent over your subsystems and your systems in general, because all these systems kind of support your business process. So you kind of have to think about, if it's more real time, then you have got to focus a bit more on event driven. The other aspect, definitely with cloud, is it's not about procuring infrastructure and such. This has all been delegated to the fact that it's now in Azure because it's available, scalable and such. But the thing you do have to factor in now, that there's also cost involved. So you have to think about the running cost of your solution as well. The other thing are more typical that you find as well, versioning, governance about who can access which kind of services, the data and such, but also automation through DevOps. So those best practices all combined. Let's just have a look and revisit some of those solutions I talked about again, but now at those practices. So looking at the cloud native integration you see right here. So you got your Salesforce and you got your ServiceNow. So those are the systems that need to exchange data. The data needs to be in a certain way consistent with each other to support their business processes. And you got your cloud. So you kind of have those systems, and you got your integration. So it's kind of the road from these services to one another. And as you can see, on the top, you see, okay, you got to deal with Salesforce admin and ServiceNow admin and your Azure admin, at least. Those three, that could be the same, well, not likely the same person, but those people have to work and collaborate together, getting access to one system to the other one. For instance, with the security, how can I access Salesforce, or how can I access ServiceNow? You got to set up some monitoring with regards to OMS, log analytics, monitor, etc. So that's more from the top. Then looking at your solution itself, you will create some more stuff around monitoring Azure. That's more technical with alerts and metrics. You will look at cost management. So within your subscription, you can set up budgets and alerts as well, because you have to look at your running costs. With regards to API management, you're dealing with identities. So you will leverage something you find in Azure Active Directory, app registrations, etc. Or maybe stuff you need to set up with managed identity. You got your key vault for your secret management. So key vault will be having, for instance, the details with regards to Salesforce, so how you can do your login and then get the token back. With Event Grid, you might set up a storage account to support the subscriptions, because an event needs to be sent out within 24 hours. If not, then the event will disappear. But you can set up that lettering, but then you need a storage account. And then with respect to API management, you have to think about setting up your APIs, the policies, so the in and outbound, potentially subscription keys, which are kind of API type of keys that you might need to provide access to your services. And then on the bottom, so there's some other aspects where you think about automation of your infrastructure. So you'll set up Event Grid once, but you might want to use an ARM template to set up those components for you. And then on the other end, you're building logic apps, so those workflow definitions and the API definitions you want to automate as well using Azure pipelines, which, for instance, you can now use YAML or something, or potentially Terraform, depending on how you want to leverage it. But if it's Azure DevOps, you can either use the classic editor or you can go forward with YAML. So in the end of the day, you have your deployment infrastructure as code, but you also have your deployment artifacts, which could be the API proxy definitions and your logic apps. In a hybrid scenario, it becomes a little bit more interesting, because you're still also dealing with an on-premise world where with a BizDoc admin, You still have your Azure admin and you have your Dynamics admin. So again, there's some administration going on, governance, access, and such. The reason I'm also listing this here is that there's also a functional side with regards to getting data from A to B, from the warehouse management system in this scenario to Dynamics. And to more have a functional monitoring capability, you can either leverage third-party products or you can set up yourself something like sending all the logging to one queue, particularly all kind of metadata, push that logic to one logic app. So one logic app will pull the queue constantly and send the data, for instance, in a Cosmos database, which holds all those events from all those steps going from the warehouse management system to Dynamics, index it in and make it exposable through a dashboard. And then you can follow through how data gets from A to B. So this is more an example of functional monitoring, something you have to think about as well, except looking at just technical monitoring. And there's a way that you can also look at some more third-party type of solutions. So BizTalk admin console and such are not so mature. And if you just want to give admin access to your environment, you might think about a product like BizTalk 360, for instance. That's a pretty targeted product with also browser capabilities, which are not available for the BizTalk admin. So it gives you a more versatile solution to monitor, for instance, this BizTalk environment. And in this use case with this customer, in the end of the day, we also decided to place BizTalk 360 as a way of monitoring in that case. And you can also potentially in the Azure realm also think about similar aspects, similar capabilities, but then more from an Azure perspective, using Service 360, for instance, as a way of doing some of the monitoring as well. Just an example. So there's ways of doing this yourself. Maybe build it yourself. So or you can leverage other products. What I try to say here, it's also a matter of buy versus build, which is another architectural aspect. So that's why I'm pointing out these solutions as well. Then there, in the hybrid way, there are some other aspects to think about as well. Again, not so much for cost management because your infrastructure is being licensed and such, so that's put in place. But there's still also in a hybrid scenario some Azure components that are in place. So again, you have to think about monitoring those services, putting up alerts, and based on the metrics, and metrics are performance counters of each of the services. And for instance, a performance counter can be logic app failed. So that's kind of a metric. So you can put an alert on that as well and configure it. Cost management is still an aspect as well, because you're putting some components out there in Azure as well, which accumulate costs, because most of these components like logic app are consumption based or have a monthly price like or an hourly price, which is in the case for API management. In this picture, you also see API management again. So there you have to think about your subscription keys, the APIs you configure, the policies, the role-based access and such, and the communication between your logic apps and Dynamics, which can be done, for instance, using an app registration. Then from a developer perspective, again, and this is a more interesting one, you have your Azure components, which similar to what I talked about before, you can use ARC templates to set up the infrastructure, YAML, your logic app workflow definitions, which you have to deploy automatically as well. So that's one aspect. And then the other end, you might have some artifacts on your BizTalk environment as well, maybe one or two applications which contains the schemas. And you have to think about automation there, but luckily you can do this with the BizTalk deployment framework. So all in all, you can do, even in this hybrid scenario, automate all your deployments. So this brings me to, okay, so you've heard about the market perspective, the solution architecture, some of the scenarios, things I worked on in the wild, the technology, so the Azure Integration Services with logic apps, event, grid, service bus, and API management. All mature technologies. We've been out there quite some years. And to choose, what technology to use, you really have to think about your requirements. And this is always the case for any type of solution where you build, if it's an integration solution, if it's another type of solution in Azure, you still have to think about those requirements as well. And based on that, you have to choose your technology. And as you've seen in the examples, I'm not using always just only a logic app. I'm combining it with leveraging also API management or queuing with service bus, or leveraging the eventing. Potentially, you can even call out to an Azure function. So the extensibility is also available in logic apps, for instance, by calling out to a function which is also capable. Back in the day, if you think about BizTalk, it's also very extensible in certain ways with functoids, with custom pipeline components and such. So the extensibility is still there, but then it's more captured into functions. The other key thing is that you really have to understand the technology on one end, the process, but also the non-functionals are key. I haven't really dived into making it more available by leveraging maybe some of the capabilities that you find in those services. With Service Bus and Event Kit, you can think about geo replication and such. So the availability might become an aspect as well, but that depends also if your target systems are redundant as well and also placed in certain co-locations and such. So I haven't seen that much in a while because it's pretty hard to do as well, to get things really more from availability standpoint. The other thing that's really important too is that you apply the best practices. And by best practices, I've showed you this, so you have to think holistically about your solution, about the monitoring, about the automation, about who gets access. So, and there's a lot of information out there in the Microsoft documentation as well. And there's also the well-architected framework that can help you in that aspect as well. Okay, so integrate, that's opening call out. I'd like to do a call out again. I've been one of the speakers. Actually, I won't talk about this topic. I will completely dive into eventing, so I'll do a more deep dive on that aspect. But this will be a virtual conference again, so don't forget to subscribe to that. And if you want to learn more about, for instance, Service 360 product, then you can also try it out with regards to your solution, depending on if you want to leverage a more, you want to buy a product instead of building your own custom solution. I just gave an example in my talk about a custom solution, but you can also choose for buying an off-the-shelf product. And yeah, this kind of concludes my talk, and I think it's back to you guys. Let's do some Q&A discussion.
Thanks, Steve, for this. Audience, please post your questions, which would be glad to answer.
Let's see if there's any questions.
Yes, Steve.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Maybe you see some questions coming in.
Not yet, Steve.
Have I been that clear?
Yeah. We have got few questions now.
Good.
Can we include Azure functions into integration services? It's from Zishan Ahmed.
That's a good question. Yes, you definitely can, and you can invoke Azure functions either using the connector. So within Logic App, as you know, there are tons of connectors, and those are managed connectors, and one is the function connector. So if your function is available within that resource group, or at least accessible, then you can, through that connector, choose your function and also the operation. The other way you can do this, if you have an HTTP triggered Logic App, then or not Logic App, I mean function, then you can also potentially use the HTTP connector. So there's two ways of calling out to a function. But usually these functions have to be HTTP triggered functions to enable you to call out to a function which can do some processing for you, which could either be hard to do in the Logic App yourself, or it's a solution of doing mapping in your function. So sometimes people leverage functions to do the mapping instead of doing the mapping with an integration account.
So how important is the proper DevOps setup to this? And do you have anything to say about that? It's from Nick over
The
Jones.
DevOps is very important. One way to harness, or at least have your code or your workflow definitions in a repo. And second to that, if you have like a UAT environment, it's important to keep all your components and your supporting like an event grid and everything consistent. So it's about consistency. If you do it manually in all those environments, then it's easy to make a mistake, easy to not having the proper setup, and then something might work in your dev environment but not work as well in your test environment. And to keep it consistent all the way through to your production environment, it's very important to have DevOps, including the fact that with your pipelines you can also incorporate some type of governance with approval stage gates in those pipelines.
Yes. So how was ISC related to Azure Integration Services? It's from Lawrence.
How's IS? Oh, ICE. Ah,
Yeah.
yes, this is the integration
Integrated.
service environment. Yes.
Yeah.
So Logic App has three, let's say, three types of hosting. So one being, of course, the one that you see most in the wild, which is just as Microsoft now labels it multi-tenant. So that's just the consumption-based one. You can also choose to have the compute. So this means that everyone on a certain resource group in a certain region will have the same infrastructure. You basically share your infrastructure. If you want to have your own runtime, so on your own Logic App and connector runtime, then you can set up what's called an integration service environment. So this will mean that it's your compute. So the hosting will be on your own reserved set of hardware. This means that upfront costs, you're getting some, amount of actions, transactions that's being called, so that's in the millions. You get your own integration account, and you also get some enterprise capabilities with VNet support, VPN, leveraging express routes, so that connectivity becomes better because you have more bandwidth. And then the third option, and this is Logic Apps and free preview, enables you to run your Logic App in an app service environment. So this is what's called single tenant if you look at the Microsoft documentation. And this means that you can run your Logic App stateful or stateless, but also have it in a container. So you containerize your Logic App, your flow, which has a bit less connector support than the pay-as-you-go Logic Apps, and then you can have it in a container, and then you can move it around. You can even host it on another Kubernetes cluster, or not on a Kubernetes cluster, which for instance is in AWS or in Google, or even put that container somewhere on the edge. So that's the third option. So there's three ways of hosting. So ICE is integration service environment, and then you got the multi-tenant and single-tenant solution. So you find this also in the Microsoft documentation. Currently, Logic App Preview, what I just talked about, the containerization of capability and stateful and stateless, is something I definitely think is going to be talked about more during Integrate, and I potentially even think that it might GA around that time or maybe later, but definitely more information about that going forward. So that's the difference between ICE, and ACE just stands for Azure Integration Services, which is just a label of those four services that I talked about.
So for change data capture, which Azure component would you recommend in scenarios like real-time data replication from SAP to Azure? It's from Muthukumar.
Real time. So yeah, depending on how much data it is, I would go with, for instance, a solution like a Data Factory, because Data Factory has also connectors and enabling you to connect to your SAP system and then kickstart a kind of a synchronization between your other system and potentially, or if it has to be in near real time and it needs a lot of performance, then another option could be that within Data Factory, you would call out to something which is called Databricks. And then you basically, in the Databricks capability service in Azure, you have lots of ways of dimensioning your infrastructure. So that means that you can set up a certain virtual machine with a lot of CPU and memory in it. So then you can really do some fast processing and more real time. I would definitely not use logic apps to do this. So it's either Data Factory or some other type of ETL capability that Azure offers, for instance, Databricks.
Yeah. Can you please explain difference between Logic App and BizTalk service? How can we migrate BizTalk orchestration to Logic App? It's from Shiva Prasad.
That's a good question as well. So Logic
Hmm.
App itself, I would say, looks a lot like your orchestration in BizTalk Server. The mapping capability, of course, is delegated to either an integration account. This is like a placeholder where you can push your maps and schemas to. By the way, also the new Logic App in preview gives you the ability to push schemas and maps, so that gives you a bit more of the mapping capability as well. With regards to the adapters, you could see some similarity with API management. Now, if you want to migrate your BizTalk orchestrations, there is a BizTalk migrator tool that's available online as well. I think Daniel Probert and some other people and Microsoft have worked on that. So there's a migrator tool available allowing you to push your BizTalk solution, which includes an orchestration towards Azure, which then leverages some of the AAS components as well. So that's available too. So that's how you can set up the migration. I'm not sure what kind of versions that tool would support, because you have BizTalk 2010, 16, 2020. So some of those implementations can leverage that tool to migrate that to Azure. I haven't done it myself because I'm usually involved in more greenfield scenarios. So, but I think it's potentially also a topic that will be discussed and presented during Integrate.
That's interesting. So any tool in Azure I can use to change the XSLT mapping file. Quentin.
In Azure itself, there's no mapping tool available. So you have you can do it on-prem using Visual Studio, and there's a plugin which enables you to do some mapping as well. Or if you have an existing BizTalk environment with Visual Studio on it, then you can do some mapping. And other ways of doing XSLT, what I've seen in the wild is that people were using Altova to do the XSLT, and then we're uploading the XSLT into to the integration account. So the integration account supports XSLT 1, 2, and 3.0. So they, kind of test and create those XSLTs on-prem using either Altova or the Visual Studio capabilities, and then upload those XSLTs into an integration account. And then the integration account needs to be explicitly tied to a Logic App, and then it provides you the ability to call out those maps. And do mind that the mapping inside an integration account also takes place in the integration account. So the Logic App will only push the workload that needs to be mapped towards the integration account while the mapping will take place. That could either be XSLT or it could be JSON mapping by using Liquid templates. But there's no Azure tooling available, as far as I know, that can do XSLT unless you do some of the online XSLT tooling. But in Azure, there's no tool available. No.
Yeah. How can you make Logic apps loosely coupled, since the workflow in Logic app is usually tightly coupled with trigger being used?
You can, if you have a flow, you can think about single responsibility kind of paradigms. So you can have one Logic app, like I showed you, which exposed an endpoint. So it's an HTTP Logic app, one only gets a payload, and subsequently push that payload towards a queue or like an event grid. So because it needs to adhere to a certain schema, and then the next Logic app will pick it up. I would not call one Logic app to another Logic app. So I would always put queues in the middle to do some decoupling, also because of the way you might want to restart it. And then if you restart a Logic app that has lots of responsibilities and lots of things it needs to do, then you have to either think about compensating action or be sure that the stuff you do in certain systems means that they're idempotent, so won't lead to duplicate records or duplicate orders or those kind of things. So to decouple your you need to decouple your logic app. That's basically what it is, and that's queuing is one of the most common thing I see in the wild with regards to logic apps and other systems. And the other thing you can do besides decoupling your systems through protocol or through like things like queues, you can also think about leveraging what's called a canonical data model. So you map to one consistent or overall kind of data model, and then from that model you map to another model which the entire system requires. So this means that you can also on the data level do decoupling.
So could you please bring a very simple example of usage API management connector in integration with D365 FO?
The simple thing is the Dynamics 365 exposes endpoints or OData. You can call OData endpoints inside Dynamics 365. So what you need to do is through Azure Active Directory set up an app registration, which also has to be configured in Dynamics. So this is where you set up your security. And then subsequently, you can use the HTTP connector in Logic App to call out to Dynamics. You can also leverage the Dynamics 365 connector. However, it has some issues also with regards to performance. So usually, there's also a blog post out, I think, by Toon van Houten on Coder, which says, use the HTTP connector to do your communication with Dynamics, not per se use that Dynamics connector. So far, in any integration I've done with Dynamics, I always use the HTTP connector. The HTTP connector has something which is Active Directory security mechanism in them. So you select that one, you leverage what's inside the app registration, and then you can just call out, any kind of endpoint or entity through OData calls in Dynamics, or maybe even just web services. So.
Yeah. So there is a question from Dusan, developer from Serbia. He has two questions. Can you
Yes.
tell us something more about real-world examples of service buses? How reliable are they? And what about pricing of the services you mentioned? Any important things to say?
With regards to service bus, I've leveraged the bus in many scenarios, and it's a very stable service. If you leverage the premium capability of service bus, so you're talking about 600-700 euros a month. You even get more enterprise features and capabilities such as geo replications and such. So if you basically set up two queues, one queue in region A and another queue in region B, and then there's kind of something in front of it. So either it will then route it to one queue or to the other queue. So this is the geo replication capability that's available in Service Bus. So it's pretty reliable and available. Pricing wise, if you use the premium, you're getting into the hundreds of dollars, euros. Then you have your standard, which is about 10 euros. And then there's even a more simpler one that costs less. API management is kind of similar. If you look at that service, there's different SKUs. There's the pay-as-you-go one, there's a basic or developer one, there's a standard one, and there's also a premium one. And you can guess the premium one also has networking support. Then your event grid is just a flat out service. It has some geo redundancy as well, but it doesn't really, I think, have different pricing levels. It's all based on operations you perform. And then the Logic app, either your Logic app is pay as you go, so it depends on the actions you perform. So each action is about 0.0000 cent. So it really has to be bulk, like in the millions. If you want more predictive pricing, that Mike would say, okay, go for the integration service environment. So I've seen that as well for a big insurance company. We set up that type of environment with ICE capabilities. So then you know the upfront cost, but you also have more of the enterprise features. But again, the prices will go up into the hundreds. So those are kind of the pricing, but queuing wise, if you look at the queue has always been a very reliable component. And I hardly had any issues with that component. So, but you find all the prices of these components online using the price calculator. So or you can go to each respective page and then look at the pricing details.
Yes. So there is a question from Uchita. What is the status of Logic App capability when integrating with on-premise Oracle servers?
Oh, I know that Oracle integration with BizTalk was already kind of an interesting thing based on the adapter, and then you need some client DLLs, and they had to be the certain version, and the version was basically, if you looked into your registry, it was hard-coded. So going forward, the connectivity on-prem can either be using VPN kind of connectivity, if it could be through express routes, then it gets even better. And that's from a bandwidth perspective. Then connectivity-wise, the best way would be to expose your Oracle capabilities, or at least what you need to access through, in my opinion, either through web services, if that's possible, using some of the client capabilities or software of Oracle itself. The other way could be, but then you have to put BizTalk in between as a kind of a proxy or an intermediate between your cloud world and your Oracle world. But then you have another component which could induce more latency, so that's not really the option either. It's kind of hard. I'm not aware if Microsoft has a connector on-premise yet available, which, in combination with the on-premise data gateway. I know there's SAP, but I'm not sure there's any capability yet for Oracle. So bottom line, it will come down to a lot of customization on the Oracle end to somehow expose or making Oracle more open, I would say.
Yeah. So Rohini has a question. Does it have any schema support in Logic Apps or function to make mapping easy?
No, question is the mapping capability is in the integration account for Logic App pay-as-you-go. With the preview, you're able to also upload schemas and maps, but the whole mapping capability has to be done on-prem, at least in some type of tool to test it, similar to how you've done it with BizTalk, with right-click on your schema and then say test schema, and then you can point to the input, for instance, to do the mapping. In Azure, there's not really a mapping capability available yet to do this, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So the mapping still remains pretty challenging, especially if it's more a simple file. Then you can, for instance, load up your data and serialize it to an object, and then do some direct mapping and then bring it back. So you can do this, for instance, in a function, or you have to do it more, using an integration account. So test and do it on-prem, upload an integration account, and then go forward. So there's not really an easy way of doing the mapping yet. It's something that's brought up to mind to the product group as well, but there's not been any traction on it yet. So
Okay. Can we use Terraform as an IAC instead of ARM templates?
Terraform is possible. I think Michael Stevenson has brought out a video, has talked about it in the past as well, leveraging Terraform as a way of deploying your Azure components. So that's another way of doing this. If it's, I'm not sure. I think it's also possible with your Logic App definitions and such. There's another way of doing deployments as well, which is called Pulumi, and then you do it more code-wise. So using code to do your deployments.
Yes, we have even published a complete demo environment using Terraform. Steve, yeah.
It's pretty common to use Terraform, especially for infrastructure as code. I see it a lot as well, where on one end the infrastructure is being deployed using Terraform, and then the Logic App and such are just done by ARM and using YAML pipelines.
Yeah. Any GitHub sample for integrated template from Simon?
Any example?
Yeah, he wants any GitHub sample for the integrated template.
Oh, I'm not aware if there's anything. Well, I have a lot of templates, of course. We created that ourselves at HSO, so not sure if I can expose that from GitHub.
Yeah.
Well, there is a way, of course, you can use the classic editor, for instance, and build up your pipeline and then extract the YAML from it and then work from that way. So then you have some example as well. ARM templates in general, there is a GitHub, there is a page on Microsoft, you can find it online. There's tons of examples of all the Azure services. So the way you can, for instance, provision a service bus, including topics and queues, API management. So any Azure service, there's ARM templates available to provision those, as an infrastructure as code way. So those are definitely available. But if you're really looking at specific logic apps and such, then yeah, you have to dig around too. But a lot there, from that perspective, ARM templates, there are lots of blog posts, but also GitHub repositories that have those.
Yes. So
But
we have a feedback. Yeah, sorry,
yeah.
Steve. Go ahead. We have a feedback.
And of course, sorry, yeah, your feedback
from Colin saying great presentation as usual, Steve Chen.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks. Now, what I wanted to say, of course, we leverage some of our own templating and integration, but we're also doing some validation and stuff, which is kind of course, proprietary, what we kind of build up. But yeah, people can also do it themselves. There's so much out there with regards to ARM templates that it's hard to not find an example how to do stuff.
Yes. Uchita has another question. What are the mapping technologies available for logic apps? Example, XSLT.
Besides XSLT, you can also, what I said before, call out a function. So you would, for instance, give the JSON, you serialize the JSON into an object. Then you have your target object, and then you just map it to the target object, and then you deserialize it back to JSON and return that. So that's something you could do. Another way would be, this would be more customization on the part of implementing such. You can also, for instance, push your schemas and XSLT to a storage account and then have the function retrieve those and then apply mapping as well. So that's another option you can do. That's kind of mimicking what the integration account does. Yeah, that's about the mapping options is either you leverage the integration account or you would leverage your custom solution, which reverts back to just using functions. So in the solution I built, currently we leverage a lot of functions because for us the schema and such is too much hassle and too much impact on the lead times we have for that project. And functions gives you code, and code gives you, as you can guess, a lot of flexibility.
Yes. So XSLT in BizTalk can call .NET DLL, although I can use XSLT in Logic App using integration account. But can this call a DLL also?
I have to really dig back into my mind if that's really possible. I'm not sure. I couldn't say yes you can, because I can't. I know what the question is because I've seen it also in BizTalk itself, but I'm not sure if it's possible in the integration account. No, I have to. The integration account is a kind of an interesting capability by itself because it's not just the mapping, but it also supports EDI, trading partner management, and integration and such. So you can really do a lot of EDI. So it also has a lot of EDI capability, which is something that's very much appreciated by companies that do a lot of EDI traffic and such. So that's the other thing that an integration account has. I would say, with regards to just the mapping, things that people in the audience are familiar with, the mapping kind of capability, it's too much dependent on an on-premise tool, and there's no good integration yet with any capability in Azure. So that's why it makes it hard. So on one end, hopefully that will become more mature as well. I know that some of the services like Adele Mooney and Jitterbit have that kind of mapping capability inside the tool itself. So that's why they're higher up in the leader quadrant, in my view.
Yes. Can you give some examples of DR strategy with logic apps?
Can you repeat that? What kind of strategies?
DR strategy with logic apps. It's
DR strategies with logic app. Yes, that would mean that the traffic to your logic app, well, what you kind of need is some health check if your environment, your region is available. That would be one end. So you need to have something in front like a load balancing kind of capability, which would either revert that traffic to the logic app A in region A, let's just say like this, and then you have to have a logic app on another region, region B. So you have to have some kind of thing like that in place, because the logic app itself doesn't have this geo-replication type of capability. The other way you could maybe do this is leveraging maybe other services that would potentially keep that payload in their service before moving to the next step. So then you have to chunk up your process pretty much in really small parts to get that, redundancy set. It's not easy. I know that Toon van Hout has did a presentation. Maybe it's something to look into. That's available as well. That talks about DR. So far, in what I've done is that DR wasn't really a big requirement because they already kind of assume that the cloud in Azure is kind of redundant, or at least is almost always available. So, and it's not really, in my view, useful to have something redundant if your target and source systems are not redundant. So then your integration solution might be redundant, but then your systems are not. So if your systems are redundant, then yeah, you have to think about your integration solution as well being redundant.
Okay. Have you had any experience of using routing slips with logic apps?
Now we're getting more into the ESB type of thing. So the way you can mimic this a bit is using topics, because topics you can, in your logic app, in the connector, you can set some properties, and that properties allows you to route the message to the correct subscription, but that's kind of ends it. It doesn't have those capabilities that you would find in the ESB toolkit with really something like a routing slip. So the only way you can kind of mimic this is having set properties on your messages before you send it to a service bus queue in the connector. But that's about it.
Yes. So Dusan says, thank you very much. I have got a meeting, got to go. Have a nice day. Awesome
Yeah,
webinar.
it's getting close to an Eastern hour. Here it's getting close to lunch. Yeah, we think we've done a good show. It's about hour, including a lot of good Q&A and discussion, so that's good.
Yes. So from Asta, what's a replacement for business rule engine in Azure?
There's no business rule engine in Azure. That's the short answer. I think you're kind of the other answer would be that you have to build it yourself, or maybe try to find if there's a third-party solution available through the Azure Marketplace that does it for you. But yeah, there's no rules engine in Azure.
Yeah. So Uchita has a feedback, just a comment, awesome presentation and Q&A. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, welcome to all the audience, everyone for attending it. So.
And that brings us to the end of the Q&A.
All right, awesome. Good.
It was indeed a real great session, followed by an very interactive Q&A segment.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I really like that too. Some really good questions. So I hope this will be valuable for the audience as well. So cool.
Yeah.
Covey.co